following is a commentary on a poem that I wrote just today called A Portrait of Kierkegaard, with the alternate title, Refusing the Wandering Soul. I'm going to do a reading of it, and then I'm going to do a little bit of background, on Kierkegaard. Maybe I haven't had enough tea yet today. I'm going to do a little bit of background on Kierkegaard to explain what I'm sort of going for and what's going on. And then at the end, I'm going to go back to the poem and break it down line way with our information about Kierkegaard incorporated back into it. So, without further ado, A Portrait of Kierkegaard, Refusing the Wandering Soul. Finding the king a man most horrid, I ventured across plains of deceit, forged through the rivers of Nihil, and conquered the mountains drear. I arrived upon a lone tower, rising above the landscape. In a pine-laden forest, occluded by a perpetual fog. Drawn in by a lantern's golden light, hanging by a porch column, I knocked heartily upon that heavy oaken slab. Reverberations echoed hollow, upward, throughout the chamber's heights, and after a patience, a moment extended, the sound of footsteps descended from on high. The door creaked wearily, and a man peeked out a single timid eye. "Did the king send you?" he asked with a wavering voice. "I come seeking refuge from his cruelty," I replied staunchly, without resolution. "So you are like myself," the fearful man said, and slammed his door shut. I waited there for weeks, through bone-chilling rains and face-scorching days, but no answer came. So I ventured out into that wood, coming upon naught else, and if left in the world, only this record of my loss. The end. So, it's not a happy ending, but if you've read anything of Kierkegaard's, you know that that's kind of his MO, his modus operandi he is a very despairing figure, which is interesting, given that he's in the world of theology. Christianity tends to have this sort of air of positivity in the modern day, and it's often portrayed in this format of what's called therapeutic deism, which is that God is sort of like your therapist, and he's like this friendly figure who's meant to refine your soul in a positive way that is seen as positive by most people. But when you read Kierkegaard, he writes these books called Fear and Trembling and The Concept of Dread. And he is a theologian at heart. He is a God-fearing man. He calls himself, he is called anyways, a Christian existentialist. And he is a very interesting figure, and I've been losing myself in his work lately, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend to most people, but I'm unemployed, so I'm able to do this. But yeah, Kierkegaard's work is deeply harrowing and dreadful, and this poem is something that I wrote to sort of reflect that. So, for example, Kierkegaard's theology, I think, is laid out most staunchly in Either Or, which is a 2-volume work. And I'm not going to pretend to be a master of it, but I've watched a few hours worth of lectures on it, and I've read about half of Either, which is the first volume, and then the second volume is Or, of course. And I've got his MO down pretty well, and I've read enough of him to sort of have an opinion on him, and to be able to write an 8-stanza, 4-line poem, talking about what he has to say. And what I see at sort of the core of Kierkegaard is essentially a self-refusal in his life as well. He's a very lonely figure. He's a very isolated figure throughout his entire life. The lone intellectual is the way that that's the archetype that he embodies, and he embodies it so completely as this sage-like figure of history. And he was acknowledged as this towering genius by everyone, but he was a lone genius. He was, his literary skill was unmatched, but the spirit behind it, people hated. There's stories that I'm not able to quite recite totally accurately that more or less talk about Kierkegaard submitting essays and things to certain academic boards and so on, and they would say, Soren, his first name, Soren Kierkegaard, your writing is incredible, but please never present anything to us ever again, because this is the most depressing thing we've ever read. And so, now that we have a little bit of a rant about Kierkegaard in here, we can return back and analyze what's going on here. So, in terms of bigger ideas going on here, I think the central line that is really important for if you're rereading, which is something I like to make sort of embedded into my poetry, is that rereading, you see something new, which is this line here. So you were like myself. His return, his sort of retort of the fearful man. And this line is, I think, very important in this, because I didn't initially have that as that line there, but it creates this duality where I never actually say that the wandering man is Kierkegaard, and I never actually say that the man in the tower is Kierkegaard. And I essentially see this as a refusal of the self, which is what I ultimately think is core to Kierkegaard, is this deep self-refusal. And the line, it begins with a refutation rather of the king, which is sort of my stand-in for God here. And I think a rejection of God is essentially a rejection of self. Now, a lot of people would probably be upset with me for calling Kierkegaard a rejection of God, because he is a Christian, he is a theologian, but the heart of why he does it is it's a rejection of objectivity. He grounds belief in God in deep subjectivity. It's that God is real to me, therefore he is real, and there's no actual objective criteria by which I've made this decision. And so the king here is Kierkegaard's understanding of God. There is this sort of mythological and romantic conception of God, which a lot of people have, and this sort of mythological conception. And I think that's the God that Kierkegaard worships, but the God of truth and the God of objectivity and the God that I believe in is a God I think Kierkegaard disbelieves and finds incredibly horrid. And so that's why I've written that line there. And so when he's venturing through the plains of deceit and the rivers of nihilism, of course, and the mountains of a dreary sort of state of being, this is sort of, once you leave that objectivity and that truth and that kingdom of those things, that kingdom of heaven, the place you find yourself outside of that, the wanderer who is Kierkegaardian in nature and that he's very romantic, he has to cross through all of these things. And then the place he arrives upon is this lone tower rising above the landscape in a pine-laden forest secluded by perpetual fog. Okay, and so it's a lone tower, so it's rising above the rest, and it's separated from the earth. It's very idealistic in that way. And pine-laden, I just needed a tree. Pine trees, I like pine trees, that's all it is. But the perpetual occlusion is also important in that you're sort of shrouding yourself from greater light. And you have your own light, which is a lantern's golden light, a thing that you light yourself, but that can burn out over time. And he has this heavy oaken slab for a door, which is, Kierkegaard 2, the man in the tower, which sort of invokes this hardiness and this entrenchment and fortification. Reverberations echoing hollow. I'm just, retreading this sort of vibe of hollowing out and emptiness and nihilism and existentialism and these sorts of things. And then Kierkegaard of the Tower takes a moment, and then he begins to descend, meaning he's not, looking to have visitors, and he's sort of struck by the idea that anyone would be visiting him to begin with, and that's echoed, of course, in that he's very timid and very afraid when Kierkegaard, the wanderer, knocks on the door. And now we get the immediate reference to the king, which is Kierkegaard talking about this, what he calls the false god, right? And now the central part of the entire poem, which is his self-rejection. What do I say about this? It's very difficult to talk about this without knowing more about Kierkegaard, because this is the most vibey part of it that I don't really have something to back up with. But reading through Kierkegaard, there's a deep sense of sort of self-rejection is the only label I can think of for it. A deep sense that he has a wandering spirit inside of him. He has a spirit of sort of love and romanticism, and this sort of very lively soul, but that he rejects that in and of himself because it doesn't meet this sort of higher standard, this sort of towering figure that he believes himself to be. And so he doesn't truly allow himself to be as great as he could be. And he keeps himself sort of locked up in this tower. And when he slams the door shut, he is slamming the door on the world, but also on the wandering soul, the part of himself that would forge the outside world. And then, of course, there's this harrowing, sort of tragic fall, which is the wandering soul spending the rest of his days out in that wood and dying there and leaving only this work itself, which is meant to be sort of like a found piece. Sort of like if you're in like Skyrim or something and you find a skeleton that has a note on it. That's kind of where I sourced a lot of this idea from, that it would be found on the dead body of this mirror of Kierkegaard. But yeah, that's pretty much what I had to say. Again, not a particularly happy poem, not a particularly, it doesn't rhyme. I didn't put that much thought into the structure of it beyond just using words that I felt like sort of fit the vibe I was going for. I, of course, wanted it to have a somewhat romantic vibe, because romanticism is a big part of Kierkegaard's philosophy, is that, he's this sort of knight in shining armor, is how he envisions himself as this knight of faith. But yeah, if you haven't read much of Kierkegaard, I don't know that I would necessarily recommend that you do read Kierkegaard, but that you, there's a few lectures on him that I think are very good. By Michael Segru is a very good one, and then there's a variety of other figures who have lectures on like YouTube and that sort of thing that are very good on Kierkegaard, that I've been watching over the past couple weeks, just sort of lacing into my day. So yeah, that's A Portrait of Kierkegaard, Refusing the Wandering Soul. And I hope you enjoyed it or got some sort of insight out of it. Thanks for watching.